Okay, any questions? Let's talk a little bit about literary aesthetics. Years ago, I met a computer scientist, a fellow by the name of Dave Weininger. Dave passed away last year. He lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and he was one of the principal people in a development known as Infomesa.
Infomesa?
Infomesa,
Like cable.
yeah. Which was a hot spot of computer science entrepreneurship in the 80s and 90s and last decade. Dave was an interesting guy. He's been in the astronaut corps. He was a linguist. He had a PhD in linguistics and a PhD in physics. And in junior high school, he wrote a language specifically for describing chemical interactions. And he went on to develop that language into a company called day8 Chemical Engineering, which had as its stock in trade computer software that the big pharma companies use to manage their proprietary databases of chemistry. And it was all done in this language called SMILES. Dave was so advanced a computer scientist that the hardware manufacturers sent him their new machines with the hopes that he could find out what to do with them. And he had a basement full of incredible computer technology, which was always being updated by the big hardware manufacturers. And I had the chance to visit with him over a weekend. And one of the things that he said to me that I've never forgotten was, how does he do what he does in the realm of computer science? And the phrase that came out of his mouth was, I treat a large amount of information as if it were a small amount of information. And at the time that I pointed out to him, this is just exactly what Chinese words do. Chinese words take a vast amount of information and reduce it down to the fewest possible number of strokes. A typical Chinese word has somewhere between 3 or 4 on the low side, up to maybe 30 strokes. But still, that's relatively little amount of effort to encode a lot of information. This tendency of the Chinese language, of course, has rubbed off on its literature. The writers who use Chinese words, in other words, are strongly influenced by this tendency of their language.
Is this simply the fact that one character or radical will mean a number of different things, or is that just a part of what you're talking about?
That's a manifestation of what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is just, a tendency of the words themselves. You take a word like chi. Chi is made up of 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 4, or some versions 5 or 6 strokes. Now think about what chi is and what you have just said when you say chi. And you realize something about the order of magnitude of the ratio of a large amount of information as a small amount of information. English words are far more egalitarian. The alphabet, the letter as the functional unit of the language, brings a certain kind of cadence or rhythm to this process of condensing knowledge. English knowledge tends to be condensed far more, what's the word I'm looking for? Homogeneously. As if it had been shaped and blended to be consistent. The Chinese is far more, it's visual. The Chinese written character is a visual experience. The English written word is the representation of a spoken experience. The Chinese have this joke about there are people who are divided by a common language because the same Chinese word, written the same way, north and south, east and west, is pronounced differently everywhere. So it puts the mind in a different operating state, to use Chinese words compared with English words. And functional MRI studies of minds engaged in such usage that have been done over the past 10 to 20 years pretty much demonstrate that. When you map a brain on English, there's a certain way in which sections of the tissues will light up with activity as you go from noun to verb and so on through a sentence. A completely different pattern is seen in the fMRIs of Chinese brains. What you tend to get is global excitation. The whole brain gets lit up in ways that doesn't happen in English. So the Chinese have developed a literary sensibility that emphasizes and tends to favor brevity of expression. One of my favorite genres in ancient Chinese literature is the micro story. Sometimes the story will be 1 or 2 sentences long. Even shorter than that, there's a phenomenon of Chinese language known as chengyu. Chengyu means accomplished words or accomplished language. And it's what we hear when we hear someone say, there's an old Chinese saying. What they're referring to is Chengyu. And Chengyu is not just an old Chinese saying, but it's an old Chinese saying that's associated with a story. For instance, there's a book in China called The 36 Stratagems, or in Chinese, San Su Liu Ji. These are it's a book on strategy. The first stratagem, each one of these stratagems is an old Chinese saying. The first one is, no deception is too much. The Chinese phrase is man tian guo hai. Man means fool. Tian means heaven. Guo means to cross. Hai means ocean. So the phrase means you fool heaven to cross the sea. Now you need to know a few things. Tian was often a way of referring to the emperor, who was seen as the son of heaven. And indeed, the story that's associated with this old Chinese saying concerns a famous emperor who was afraid of water. And during one campaign, his army had pursued the enemy to the shores of a vast lake. And as they dispersed and fled into the wilderness and across the lake, this emperor ordered his generals to stop the pursuit. And when he met with them to discuss why, it came out that he was averse to the water. He was afraid of getting on the water. So the general said, "Oh, no problem, Your Highness. Then we'll stop here and celebrate." So that night they stopped. They built a big platform for dancing, lit fires, of course got out the booze, and they got him drunk. And he passed out. He woke up in the morning on the other side of the lake, because the structure they had been building was not a platform for partying, but a raft. And this is an example of deceiving the emperor into thinking one thing so that he would consent. And it stands for this basic strategic principle. No deception is too much. Inspired by such things, deceiving people has become a national pastime in China. Chengyu. The language is full of these things. The language is full of short stories, short expressions. Poetry gained, and once again, this is not unique to the Chinese. Poetry certainly has gained tremendous status in many cultures around the world. But in China, poetry is really, the heroes of the ancient world were poets. There are famous generals, but there are legions of famous poets marching down through Chinese history. And certainly among the most revered names in the Chinese pantheon are the names of poets. You know the Dragon Festival, the dragon boats on the 5th day of the 5th lunar month. this celebrates the life and, more specifically, the death of a poet who, you know why they race the dragon boats? They race the dragon boats to disturb the water, because this one particular poet was executed by throwing him into the lake or the stream, where his body was consumed by the creatures in the stream. So on the 5th day of the 5th month, people take zongzi, which are those rice cakes, rice dumplings, and they throw them into the water to bring the fish, and then they race the dragon boats to disperse the fish, to disrupt the fish so the fish won't eat the poet. It's, one of the most important festivals in the Chinese calendar. So we see in the Chinese literary traditions an emphasis on the short, on the brief. And one of the ways that they accomplish this is with another important principle of Chinese literary aesthetics, which is never point your finger at the moon. Never say what you mean to say. The Chinese somehow intuited fairly early on in their collective literary career that what people really valued about a work of literature was not so much what was going on in the text as what was going on in their mind as they read the text. And the Chinese writers came to understand that if you came out and stated precisely what you meant to say, you deprived your reader from arriving at his or her own conclusions. Yep. So they developed a literary style imbued by this way of thinking of never stating your purpose, never stating your objective, never pointing your finger at the moon.
I'll give you an example. A song I've been wanting to learn is Pastures of Plenty by Woody Guthrie, from the point of view of migrant workers. And the last verse is, this land I'll defend with my life if need be, so your pastures of plenty will always be free. And when Holly Near and Ronnie Gilbert, who lived here, recorded it, they changed it. This life will defend from corporate greed. And I couldn't even play it on the radio because they'd taken something that was ironic, right? Implying we've done all this work for you guys and your bright sparkling wine and all that, even up till dying. And it was all done by illusion. And the way these people rewrote it, it was, no, don't. Do you understand what I'm saying? They just made it too obvious, thinking they'd improved it.
Your use of precision there made me think of the precise nature of those fMRIs, having a single spotlight up for an English use of the language versus a global. I was reading a grammar book, and they use the term optional precision as far as an approach to the language, and having a logographic language versus a alphabetic language gives much more of that opportunity for global engagement versus a precise, which fits, I think. That's what I was hearing a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of it does relate to the neural architecture of perception and the fact that visual perception and oral perception are really kind of two distinct modes of processing the world. the sound-based language, like English and its related languages, kind of proceeds in an orderly way through the world. Whereas the visual language, moment by moment, the world is a complete wholeness. This sense of motion is quite different.
Do you think that might be similar with the deaf person's perception of language?
Conceivable.
You mean with sign language?
Because they can't hear what the intended words are, and everything they're having to visualize.
You're in the world of neurocognition for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense.
I wonder, we're now working with the Huainanza Chapter 7 in Sean's group, and that has the visual text, but has it laid out in the traditional non-block type, top to bottom, right to left, where you'll have patterns within the text. So it adds even another dimension to this visual wholeness, as you said, of the experience. I don't know, there's not many texts I haven't seen other than Elizabeth's group's work on that, Huainanza Chapter 7, where it's not in block text, but it has its own geography or terrain to the actual specific text, and that we were wondering what that does to the audible side of things, because it does give it a cadence and a rhythm, and then the repetition of characters within the repetition of pattern gives it definitely something, but it also is so striking visually to see that. Just that's another way to look at the language.
I remember many years ago I was taken to a Buddhist temple outside of Chengdu, and one of the artifacts that was on display was a bit of calligraphy, maybe a couple hundred characters. It was larger than this, but the characters were that size. So there was hundreds of characters, and the monk that was showing it to me, I asked him how was the text to be read. Did this text go left to right, top to bottom, left to right, top to bottom, right to left? And he looked at me and he said, "It's all okay." I said, "What do you mean it's all okay?" And then he proceeded to show me that if you read it this way, it made sense, told the story. If you read it this way, it made sense. If you read it this way, it made sense. And he said, we have yet to find any way to combine these characters that doesn't work. And he kind of smiled and he said, it's kind of special. So like I said earlier, one of the ways in which Chinese and English compare and don't is that the Chinese written language preserves the potency of its words. Not only do Chinese words have many meanings, but they have the mode of retaining their many meanings even after they are used. Now, in the back of my mind, I hear our friend Oving ranting about Chinese grammar and imposing his sense of meaning and understanding on all of this, and certainly there is a very powerful trend in Western academia that dispenses with this character of the Chinese language and attempts to see it as a much more Western language-like experience. I just think that's a big mistake. And certainly when you're dealing with texts like Lao Tzu, that is more than 2,500 years old, you're dealing with an approach to language which was not at all conditioned by the language tendencies of modern languages. You know, we know for a fact that this was an important enough text that tombs that were sealed more than 300 or 400 years before the year 0 included copies in their burial libraries. So people have been depending upon Lao Tzu for meaning for a long, long time.
So they'd have something to read after they were dead?
Precisely. Something to read while eating all the food that they were buried with and enjoying the people that they were buried with. You know, noble men were buried with their families, often alive. Of course, they didn't stay alive very long.
Their families meaning wives and children?
Yeah.
I was surprised they do that with children because that's your legacy.
I'll look into it.
Okay.
But I'm fairly certain that wives, at least,
They're dispensable. Replaceable.
wives and sons. Let's talk about some of these basic terms. I think that earlier we've talked about Tao. Tao. This stuff on the right-hand side means head. The two dots on the top may refer to the eyes, or to light coming into or out of eyes, may more pictorially refer to hair on top of the head. The box below that might be another reference to the eyes. And this head is depicted on this thing, which is a foot in motion. It's a radical that's often found in words having some sort of movement. So the etymological sense of Tao is a head engaged in perception, moving through the world. What the heck does that mean? Well, the word most commonly used in English to translate it is way. When we think of the way in its maybe broadest sense of meaning, the way things are, the way things go. Each of us has our way in life. Can you find your way? More colloquially, it simply means path, as in a footpath, or a path for automobiles, or whatever. It can mean boulevard. In the cosmological sense, it means the totality of phenomena. And in Lao Tzu, we find it often used in this cosmological sense. I think of perhaps the most famous passage, I think it's chapter 10, that begins, the Tao gives birth to one. This little formula is important to understand Taoist cosmology. It says the Tao gives birth to one gives birth to two give birth to three, and three give birth to 10,000 creatures. And by 10,000 creatures, what is meant to be expressed is everything. The 10,000 things is a reference to all creation. So how do we understand those cosmological dynamics? And how do we understand them as defining the meaning of Tao? First of all, notice where Tao lies in the sequence. It's the very first term. The Tao gives birth to oneness. So Tao provides the conceptual basis for conceiving of the universe as a whole thing, as an entirety. Tao gives birth to one. It really defines that when we begin making such a statement, what we're focusing on is the universe as a whole. Its oneness, its whole thing, that's the product of Tao. That unity, that wholeness, gives birth to two. Two, we have to understand two as yin and yang. Two give birth to three. Three is the level of qi. Qi is the betweenness, remember. Qi is the thing that acknowledges the distinct existence of that which does not exist, yet is between yin and yang. And the cosmological significance of the end of the whole formula is that that's as complex as you need to be in your cosmological accounting before you stand on the launch pad of everything. Once you get to the level of threeness, the next step leads you to the universe in its manifest glory. That's where everything comes from. It's an utterly simple, yet conceptually enormously powerful formulation about the patterns of cosmic creation. That's what Tao means. A pretty darn useful term. Who were the Taoists? Well, they were the people, and here we're thinking mainly of the Taoist authors, or the authors of the ancient Taoist texts, more so than the priests of the Taoist religion. They're the people in China who were self-consciously concerned with these cosmological questions. What is the origin of the universe? What is the origin of life? And they're driven by concerns which are similar to those of farmers. In other words, they're not looking to entertain themselves or simply occupy their minds. They're looking for a way of developing technology for survival. They made these inquiries in order to understand what to do with their own human potential in order to improve their chances of survival. And this kind of thinking is what gives rise to the approach to medicine that we find coming to its kind of first formal iteration in works like the Yellow Emperor's Classic. So that by sometime around the 2nd century BC, we see these ideas which have been swirling around in China for hundreds of years, gaining clear focus on what are the laws governing human health and well-being. And as the nation and the culture shifted its attention to its new unifying emperor, in 220 BC, China experienced a unique thing. The period of some 1,000 years which had preceded that date was marked by endless warfare between what came to be known as the warring states. The land area that we know as China, in other words, was a series of maybe as many at times as a dozen feudal kingdoms which were pretty constantly battling with each other for hegemony over the territory. Well, in 220 BC, that comes to an abrupt halt. It comes to an abrupt halt under the leadership of Qin Shi Huangdi, who is known as China's first emperor. He unifies the land area formerly divided into warring states. And of course, one of the things that he requires of his new citizens is loyalty and obedience to his word and his rule. In order to accomplish this, he carried out language reform so that everybody could understand what everybody was saying. He normalized the road so people could travel throughout the kingdom with carts with their wheels the same size. He built the Grand Canal to further facilitate movement. He normalized weights and measures. He carried out all manner of initiatives meant at unifying the people around a mutual understanding of some of the most basic aspects of their lives. And of course, medicine got swept up in this. So what we see being expressed in the early medical texts is this sensibility of conforming with the law as being of primary value in attaining good health, as it states in the Yellow Emperor's Classic. Those who obey the rules of nature thrive, those who disobey them perish. I'm going to skip over duh and make a little presentation for you about that character because it's a little complicated and I want to bring some more resources to bear on it so we don't sort of spin our wheels with it. But with the remaining minutes that we've got, if you're happy with Tao, we can go on to the concept of Wu Wei, another fundamental concept that helps us to understand the character of the Lao Tzu text. As far as I'm concerned, there is no more basic issue in that text than Wu Wei. Wu means without. Wei is a very interesting word. It can mean to be, it can mean to be called, it can mean to act, it can mean to pursue, to follow. If you apply this word Wu to any one of those, you get an interesting idea. The common English expression to sum that idea up is non-action. So we say Wu Wei means non-action. What is non-action as an ideal? Chapter 48 of Lao Tzu begins, it says, to follow the Tao, actually the opening line says, to follow study, every day you accumulate. To follow the Tao, every day you lose. Lose and lose until you attain non-action. Non-action, but nothing left undone. That sentiment expresses the essence of the Taoist ambition. The Taoist ambition is to do everything by doing nothing. In an earlier chapter, I think it's chapter 5 maybe, it says the sage, meaning the person imbued with the spirit of the Tao, follows the wordless teaching and manages affairs with non-action. Do a little experiment with yourself. Try to spend 2 hours this afternoon managing your affairs with non-action. Unless,
Not answering email?
I was just going to say, unless you're driving a car, be strict with yourself. Really spend 2 hours managing everything you do by not doing it.
Huh.
Just 2 hours.
If we like it, can we continue?
Yeah, but I think you have to report yourself to the government. You know, what are we trying to do in Taiji?
Stillness in motion.
You took the words right out of my mouth. seek stillness in movement. There's another way to say seek stillness in movement, which is act by not acting. Sometimes people want to know, how old is Taiji? I tell them the best historical records that we have seem to indicate that it doesn't originate earlier than the Song dynasty. The Song dynasty maybe begins in the 11th or 12th. But though Taiji as an organized experience is no older than that, the ideology that informs and animates Taiji dates back to Wu. This is another reason why this little adventure in Lao Tzu is necessary for us. Because we've got to come to terms with this text. Because if Taiji is, as Martin always taught me, the cultivation of consciousness, then we need to understand what the people who originated the ideas that we follow understood consciousness to be. That's what's expressed in Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu is the text in which we find the ancient scope of the field of the mind is delineated. And that indeed is the rationale for why to engage in a commentary on the text, so that we can inhabit the text. The text can inhabit us. Does all that make sense? Maybe we should have a test.
I remember the first time I came across Wu Wei was probably a year before I got my first copy of the Tao. It was in a pop management literature class. The idea was to do more with less. Common maybe westernization of a very hard lesson to be learned that I don't know that I've learned yet. So, any thoughts on that, as close but not quite, or missing the mark completely?
Well, you see how it runs at diametrically opposed kind of perspective to the thrust of modern society. Modern society is all about consuming. More and more and more.
More is better is one of our basic operating metaphors.
Yeah, if a little is good, more is better. That's understood to hold for everything. Well, that kind of sentiment is quite foreign to this ancient Chinese perspective, which says, contrary-wise, that the middle way is the best way. Not too much, not too little, right in the middle. I saw a great little quote the other day. I forget who was the author, but someone said, it may be true that money doesn't buy happiness, but poverty doesn't buy happiness. And that's quite a Chinese perspective on things. If there is happiness to be bought, it will be bought with the coin of the middle, not to incline this way, not to incline that way. It's the principle that is represented in Tai Chi by the upright body. The upright body is the unwobbling pivot that does not incline in any direction, but permits 360-degree movement. In fact, if you incline just 1 degree off true, you mess up that permission. Well, it's nearly 2 o'clock. We've done it again, frittered away 2 otherwise valuable hours.
We could have been answering email.